because I would leave home at 6 o'clock to be in London for a 10 o'clock start. Getting into London was a nightmare. When you got in, it was a nightmare to try and park on double yellow lines whilst you got the kit out. And I never even used drum cases most of the time because it was quicker to just get the drums straight in as they were. Then you had to get the kit out again and get it all in the car. And then it was off to another studio to do exactly the same thing. All the studios seemed to be in places where it was hard to park. But we did it, and you just did it as, that's what it was about. That's what it was about. I used to be able to wallpaper with the amount of car parking tickets that I got. Oh, goodness me.
But overall, you enjoyed being in the session?
Generally speaking, yes, I did. There were some sessions that I didn't enjoy doing because it wasn't my type of music. And I used to have to do there was a strict tempo dance orchestra that I used to work with, and I think Jimmy Page again used to do some of those sessions.
I think he did as well, yeah.
Yeah, and we used to crack up at the arrangements. I mean, they really were lovely Mickey Mouse arrangements, and I used to get so bored sitting there playing away and thinking, you know, sitting in the studios there, musical directors conducting, all this orchestra around me, and I'm thinking about, I wonder if I can get a couple of swift pints in before I get home tonight, etc. You know, your brain just goes dead on you.
The reality of a job.
You're so bored.
I remember reading as a kid growing up in America that Jimmy Page was responsible for about 70% of the guitar work that came out of English recordings between about 63 and 67. So you must have been quite a tight-knit group playing on everything together.
We were. The thing was, of course, that the general public didn't know. They didn't realise that the records that they were buying were not always the groups themselves. There were exceptions, like the Beatles, for example, played on their own records, apart from their very first record, which had a guy called Andy White, a session musician called Andy White on drums, instead of Ringo.
Yes.
But after that, then they played on their own records. Nobody bothered about the big artists, shall we say, like Shirley Bassey or Jackie Trent or Petula Clark, because people knew that that was an orchestra backing them. You know, they didn't carry a 70-piece orchestra around with them or whatever it was, so people weren't bothered about that. But the groups went to great lengths to make sure, and the record companies went to great lengths to make sure that us session men never gave it away of what we were actually doing on the records.
To diminish the group's image as players in the public's eye.
Well, that's true. And a lot of the groups and sometimes solo artists were signed because they were very good-looking kids.
As opposed to players.
Yeah, or singers. You know, there's one or two singers that I know, certainly, on their live stage shows have used professional session singers off stage to hit the high notes for them. They just had mimed to the high notes. It's the only way they could get away with it. It wasn't only going on here, it was going on in the States as well, because my friend and colleague Hal Blaine told me that he was on a lot of huge hits in America. Like the Monkees, for example. The Monkees apparently only sang on their records. They didn't actually play on them.
It was just the last one I think they played on.
Possibly,
yeah. Which didn't do very well.
No. The main reason for it was simply it was a financial reason, I think. The record companies allocated 3 hours to artists of studio time, and in that 3 hours they had to try to put down 4 titles, and they just couldn't do it. A lot of the groups just couldn't do it. So the record company said, well, let's bring in the session guys because they can do it, you know, and we'll get a better performance. And that was it. The groups never really complained because they were so excited they got signed by a record company. They weren't too bothered that there were other musicians on it, on their records. So I can't ever recall any of the groups ever moaning to me about, oh, you know, we should be on the records and not you guys. Yeah, I think Van Morrison was the only one that really wasn't too happy, because I remember reading in his book where he mentions about Jimmy Page and I being on his records, that he wasn't very happy about it at all. And the producer of that was a man called Burt Burns, an American who wrote, I think he wrote Twist and Shout. And Burt employed us to do it. And Van Morrison said, well, my guys are perfectly adequate, why aren't you using them? But yeah, that was the policy with the record companies, and that was it.
Well, they knew you could deliver, and if time is limited, they've got to. It's still a product. I mean, I love music and consider it, you know, a very important art form. But to a businessman who runs a record label, it's still a job, and he's got to get it out on time. And you guys would come up with the goods.
Well, a lot of the artists as well didn't even realise that after they'd gone, I was often, and Jim Sullivan and Jim Page were often called in to overdub what they'd done.
Tidy it up a bit.
Yeah, yeah.
Wow.
I mean, you know, there's one or two groups who should be nameless who still say to this day it was them playing on their records. They don't realise it was us. And the poor old drummers are still thinking, oh dear, I played well on that session.
Wow, I was fast on that, wasn't I?
Yeah,
that was a nice type signature.
Their drums are sort of buried somewhere underneath mine in the mix, you know.
So they're maybe, but not.
Yeah, they're there. They're there, but
okay.
Only jazz.
Okay.
So there was an awful lot of that went on at the time, but it was just part of the course. That's what was expected.